Hello and welcome to the Counterweight podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, we'll be talking to Spencer Case about patriotism and its malcontents.
Okay, hello and welcome to the Counterweight podcast. I'm here, my name's Mike as usual, I'm here with Elizabeth, and together we are joined by the philosopher Spencer Case. Hello, Spencer.
Hello, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure's all ours, I assure you. All right, so we've got a few issues that we wanted to talk about. The first point we were going to talk about is the notion of patriotism. Now, as I understand it, you're in the process of writing a book on that. Is that correct?
I've just started. So right now you should really think of this as I'm still thinking through a lot of the stuff I want to say. And, I might have a different perspective when I'm done with the book, but yeah, I've been thinking about it.
Great. Okay. Well, hopefully this can be helpful then. Okay. So I'm going to start with a really kind of UK centric point of view that I understand is different to the way in which you two would experience the notion of patriotism, both being Americans. So growing up in England, as somebody largely middle class English, and this is different to being Welsh or Scottish, by the way. You know, if you're Welsh or you're Scottish in the UK, being patriotic is seen as being a perfectly good thing that is very much compatible, if not emblematic, of the kind of left-wing values that are, dominant, I think, in elite discourses. So, for example, the Scottish Nationalist Party is a very left-wing organisation, and that kind of patriotism is seen as being perfectly proper. The same with the Welsh. And even the Cornish, if you like, too, even though they're not a country anymore. Nevertheless, I've always felt that there is a very uneasy relationship between the English and patriotism, that it kind of changed a bit in the Blair era when we had kind of cool Britannia, and we started to rehabilitate the image of the United Kingdom post-Empire. And certainly lots of brands seem to put Union Jacks on their produce nowadays, which I think is more to do with the fact that it resonates greatly among the working class. But amongst the middle class, among the people who read The Guardian and The Independent, patriotism was always seen, at best, something that was very problematic. It might be embraced in some small ways, based upon the kind of England that exists today as distinct and largely divorced from its past. But being patriotic in the sense that you were celebrating the likes of Horatio Nelson and his victories at the Battle of Trafalgar, or the Duke of Wellington, or the successes of the Industrial Revolution, or at the absolute worst, if you were celebrating and feeling proud of some of the things that, for example, Churchill felt proud of, some of the good things that perhaps the British Empire delivered, such as standing up against the Nazis, there's something quite wrong with that. And I think we've seen that recently with quite a lot of vandalism happening to these statues of Victoria, statues of Churchill, people who are very much revered within the UK by certain sections of society, but hated, or if not hated, seen with deep suspicion by the middle classes. Any idea what's going on there?
It's interesting. I was just thinking about today because I was reading some things Roger Scruton had written about it, about how the United Kingdom, you've got nested nationalities, you've got national loyalties within like greater national loyalties. And I guess when you mentioned that the Scottish Nationalist Party is very left-wing, I can sort of see how there could be like a "we are the resistance" kind of narrative if you're one of the other members of the United Kingdom. So, yeah, that just never occurred to me before. As far as what you're saying, though, I think there's a very general thing going on in the West. And I've seen it a lot in the US too, where it's not really cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is a kind of detachment, I guess, from one's own country. But it's what Scruton would call oikophobia. I've called it inverted nationalism in one article I've written, or it's like it's an oppositional sort of relationship. It's still very personal, but it's sort of like the kind of relationship somebody has who just like seems obsessed with hating their own father or something like that, where it's still personal. It's not like a sense of detachment, but it's a kind of angry resentment that it seems to pervade everything.
Maybe a codependency in psychological terms, right? We need it to keep fueling us, but in a not a healthy way.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I gotta give you a couple examples of this, if that's okay.
Please.
So one example, I'm going to describe it actually in more detail in my my next podcast, which is microdigressions, by the way, which I hope you all.
Oh yes. We'll leave a
link to it.
We'll link to it in the show notes. Absolutely. And actually, we're going to do an intro as well, and we'll put that into the intro. We usually record that separately. But yeah.
Okay. So when I was a Fulbright grantee, a Fulbright grant is something that the U.S. State Department offers for people to study or to do some sort of service project abroad. And it's kind of like an unofficial or quasi-official ambassadorship program. Like, you're supposed to be representing your country well. And I was most of the way through doing mine in Egypt, which is a philosophy research program. This was in 2013. And there was a regional meeting. So everybody in the Middle East got together and they started talking about what they were doing for their Fulbright projects. And there was a young woman there who was teaching Moroccan school children. And she was describing how she got like 12 days or so to teach these kids about the U.S. And what she said was so unrelentingly negative. Like, I would not expect somebody from North Korea to make their country sound that bad. To the point that the Moroccan teachers were like, stop, don't do this. You're crushing these kids' dreams. They wear American flags and they, look up to your country, and you're just crushing them. And she just persisted, to the point that there was one kid who raised his hand and said, Mark Twain was a great American writer. Like, at least there's that, right? And so she said she actually went to the library and found a copy of The Innocents Abroad, and where, this is Mark Twain's travel book, where he's going through these countries and insulting everyone he sees, because that's Mark Twain. And she flips open to a passage and reads it to the student where he says something insulting about Moroccans and says, see, Mark Twain hates you. And then the kid was just completely disabused of, the idea that America was something good. And she said this at a conference full of people who were there to be ambassadors to the U.S. It's just like, it blows my mind that everybody clapped and applauded, like, what a great presentation. And what's up with that? I know that it's there more than I know how to diagnose how it came about. I have some thoughts, but I want to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the place where I found it, and this isn't the origin point, and I'm not suggesting that it's the origin point, but I think the place where I found it best articulated in really clear and concise fashion was at the beginning of Charles Mills' The Racial Contract. I think it's right there in the introduction. I guess you've read that, right? Again, Mills is an interesting thinker.
I have not, actually.
Okay. He's an interesting thinker. Some of what he says, I think, is a bit crazy, but he has some interesting points. And I very much like his defense of liberalism, even though I don't quite agree with the kind of liberalism he wants to move towards. But credit where credit's due. But he, in the beginning of that book, and again, audience forgive me because I can't remember what page or even precisely what chapter, but I think it was in the very introduction. He talks about the fact that the world is kind of governed by white supremacy. Not just America, but America is the very focal point of this, he thinks, and that it's this white supremacy that permeates and defines the whole international liberal order. And he seems to mean not just in the United States or Europe, but throughout not just the developing world. Maybe you could say, okay, to try and steel man, you could say, okay, well, large parts of sub-Saharan Africa are largely dependent upon the IMF, which is a vision that is dependent in turn upon America and maybe to a smaller extent the United Kingdom and Europe. And therefore that's mainly made up of white men, and therefore that's white supremacy. Now, that's not what I believe, obviously, but again, trying to steel man what he's saying. But he seems to think that, and I found this with also educational scholars who are working in places like Japan and South Korea, which are, very successful societies that are very, very homogenous, have very few white people working and living there. Of those few who do, there are hardly any in any significant positions of power. And if they get into them, they're very often removed. I'm not saying on the basis of racism, but for whatever reason, they're very often removed. And yet, a thinker as obviously articulate, eloquent, and bright as Mills was, unfortunately died recently, nevertheless seemed to be making the cases that white supremacy is the kind of the motivating action in these countries as well. And this seems almost narcissistic, doesn't it?
I have a theory.
Yeah.
I have a theory. I guess my theory is that in the 20th century, over the course of the 20th century, the people on the left, like the educated liberal types in the Western world, they came to identify with themselves based on what they were against. They were against imperialism, and they were against racism, and they were against things that looked like you could describe them as the excesses of nationalism. And I think what happened was, once you got a critical mass of people whose moral political identities were defined by opposing this one thing, you get to where they're not worried about moving to any kind of other excess. There weren't enough people who were in the intelligentsia who were saying that, let's think about the good side of national identity or something like that. It was like I guess a prolonged overreaction to some very bad things created this mentality. I guess that's my theory for what happened.
I think that that there's some psychological research that backs you up, in that Jonathan Haidt and others have done some research on the types of morality that more liberals endorse or are focused on, as sort of as you mentioned, the kinds of injustices or problems or whatever that liberals are focused on, and the sorts that people who tend to be more conservative focus on. So liberals or the left tend to focus more on care and harm. So the suffering of others, particularly people who are vulnerable. So it's triggered sort of by signs of weakness or pain, and it elicits sympathy. And they're also more concerned about fairness and or cheating. So it focuses on concerns about justice and reciprocal relations. While people who lean more right or conservative tend to be interested in loyalty and betrayal. So about commitment to groups. It's the sort of this is sort of the foundation of strong groups, and it triggers pride or even rage when loyalty or betrayal is violated. They're also more concerned about authority and subversion, about finding your place in a social hierarchy, about authority and respect, and this elicits pride or maybe shame or fear when it's violated. And then the third type of morality that Haidt found that the right or conservatives are more interested in is purity or degradation. So it centers on avoiding disease and contamination, and it elicits disgust. So this is related, I think, to the culture wars in that liberals are attaching importance to different domains. So we might be interested in the same goals, but as we focus on different domains or processes maybe of reaching those goals, it inflates the differences, and we forget to talk about the actual goals because we're too busy fighting about maybe the way to get there. So even patriotism looks different, maybe to the different sides.
Can I say a couple things about Haidt? I was thinking about this the other day, wondering, because that book came out in 2012, The Righteous Mind, and he'd been, doing work on this, these moral taste buds, this kind of theory, for about a decade, a little more before that. But I'm wondering how things look now, like a decade later. Because think about it, the whole don't say the N-word in any circumstance whatsoever, even if you're quoting someone, if you're a white person, that smacks of purity ethics, doesn't it?
Yes.
And there's a whole lot of stuff in left-wing identity politics that seems very loyalty-oriented, like
Kanye West not being black.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say. That not being a real black person if you're
or not being
of
real
the
gay,
wrong politics or whatever. Yeah,
not being really gay.
So,
like they said that about Douglas Murray. He's not gay. He's just somebody who is sexually attracted to men. That's not gay anymore. That very much smacks as loyalty.
Yeah. So I wonder if that kind of reasoning stands up so well.
Well, there is a whole, I mean, I think that left-wing authoritarianism is now, it's a thing now that people write about and talk about, and there's a left-wing authoritarianism scale, for example, that, so I agree. And certainly, so Mike and I talked last week about shame, and shame is definitely a purity, sort of degradation, contamination, disgust kind of emotion, of morality, and used, we use that type of morality manipulation in order to bring people in line. And certainly the left is now much more interested in using that, sort of purity, degradation kind of morality against violators, so certainly it's been used again. I mean, I've been shamed over and over again, publicly and privately in trying to get me, sort of back in line. So I agree. And I think that's a really, someone should do that research. So Jonathan Haidt, if you're listening.
I mean,
but I like this idea of focusing on different things, and because we're focusing on different aspects of the same problem, not being able to talk to one another about, you mentioned, like in the blurb about the book, which I understand is written sort of this fundamental disagreement about the nature of society and whether it's fundamentally good or bad. And that's what, brought the, Jonathan Haidt's research to mind.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I was just thinking, completely anecdotally, based on my experience, when I was growing up, the majority of people who I would get into nearly fisticuffs kind of debates with were usually older than me, usually male, and they were people who were raging on about the evils of gender equality, about the evils of immigration, about how immigration was a terrible thing, that it was diluting the character of the United Kingdom, about how these people didn't get us on some kind of fundamental level. And these were the people I debated with for most of my adult life, in fact. And what I noticed is that this began to change around about 10 years ago. But it was a new set of people who were coming out with completely different arguments, right? They weren't the same arguments. Now the arguments were how everything is racist, and if you don't acknowledge your part in racism, then you are yourself, guilty of racism in some way, or how everything is homophobic, how the appropriate way to look at books and television would be to analyze the power dynamics, and that that people who I would have agreed would have been minoritized, minority communities, were victimized, how we had to agree completely with this worldview. And it very much seemed like this purity check that was previously something I'd been fighting on the right had now become just as strong, if not actually stronger, because now it was supported by the various institutions like The Guardian. And now it was on the left. And it very much feels like, to me, the kind of person, and I'm not talking in terms of their political opinions, but in terms of their psychological profile, if you like, their desire for purity and loyalty, the kind of person that I'm fighting since I was a kid hasn't really changed. It's just they used to be right-wing, and now they seem to be left-wing. But all the behavior seems the same. I mean, I recently I saw something on, I don't know if you saw a video clip, for example, on gender ideology, as some kid in a UK school stood up and said, no, I think there are only two genders. And this teacher just comes down like a ton of bricks on him, talking in a really patronizing tone and saying, look, that's your opinion. You can keep it to yourself. You can have your opinion. The authority says otherwise. That kind of opinion is not welcome in this school. You can have your opinion, but you.
But if he would have said any other number,
right?
Any other number but two.
But okay, so yeah, right. But that was the same kind of guy, literally with the same kind of accent, the same kind of demeanor in the UK, that would have a go at me when I contradicted a teacher when I was in secondary school, aged 14, for example, on saying that, there actually might be some really serious benefits to immigration. It was the same kind of tone and the same kind of way he spoke to that kid, albeit now it was an extreme left-wing purity ideology, whereas before it was something that would have been associated with the right. But the purity and the vitriol and the assumed righteousness was all there. So, I mean, the kind of thing that Haidt talks about, I mean, maybe he was right when he was writing in 2010, drawing on research that was presumably from a few years earlier. Maybe that was correct. Maybe this is just the way that people in power behave. I don't know.
Now, I think I see a connection back here with patriotism, what we were saying earlier, the stuff we were talking about earlier. So it occurs to me now that if you think of how you resist something like racism or any kind of bigotry, you have to form a sort of in-group, or make sure the in-group has a sense of dignity, So you saw this with like gay pride. You saw this, of course, with black people, like, asserting themselves, and, black is beautiful and that kind of thing. And so as a response to some kind of oppression, real or perceived, or marginalization, real or perceived, people come together and they sort of invest themselves in these sorts of identities as a protective strategy. And I think maybe if you keep doing that, I think a lot of what's happened with left-wing politics in the U.S. is looking back at the success of that model for the civil rights movement and just sort of reiterating it or doubling down on it. There's similarities with what happened with the gay rights movement, at least as far as that's concerned. Coming together and, asserting your identity and being, bold and proud and, that kind of thing. I think maybe one thing that happens with this strategy is that once you get it going for a particular purpose, which is to basically rein in some excesses in society where they're not treating with sufficient dignity. But once it's established for enough time, these other identities might start to rival other forms of identity. So it might be that your identity as an anti-racist, because it gets broadened beyond just the group that's oppressed. Your identity as an anti-racist is now in tension with other things you might have identified as an American, for instance. So it might be that people have to find their sense of identity in something, and for a long time, the nation is one of the things that provided that sense, and religion provided that sense. But religion has been on decline for a long time. Now I think more and more people are investing themselves in this sort of I don't know what would you call it. You could call it an ideological group, but it's not ideological for everyone. But I don't know. You see what I'm saying? Like there's this rival identity that comes about to try to correct for something, and then it just keeps going. It keeps snowballing.
I think tribal makes more sense.
Tribal.
Yeah, carry on, Elizabeth. Yeah, tribal. I think tribal, because they don't seem to know the arguments, right? If you're an ideologue, you'd seem to know your position. They often don't. So sometimes they do, but they often don't. So I think tribal is best. Anyway, carry on, Elizabeth. Sorry.
Well, a couple of things I wanted to say was one thing that happens as groups get larger, they tend to lose track a little bit, sort of like Mike was saying, of their ideological roots and start focusing more on violators. So now they start to become experts on who's violating, our sort of our rules, as opposed to sort of building that dignity and trust, in-group dignity and trust. They focus more on violators. So that was one thing that I was going to say. But the other thing is this sort of idea about, identities and stuff, and patriotism does sort of touch on some research that one of my students did on the military, and we compared civilians who were job hunting to military personnel who were transitioning out of the military and separation and looking for jobs. And one of the measures that we used was identity fusion, and we also used sort of Aaron and Aaron's relationship circles overlapping. So the more that you identified with either your job or, if it was a civilian or the military, the more overlapping your circles were, the self and the military. Okay. So it's sort of related to what you're talking about. And so identity fusion was, as one might expect, far higher in military vets, more, twice as high. And the same with the sort of self and overlap with either a job or, in the case of the military, the military. And interestingly, we expected to find that veterans were struggling a lot more with some aspects of the transition than we actually found. So they actually had a much better sense of self. Military veterans, especially those who had more overlap with the military, their military identity, or more identity fusion with country. So those who were more patriotic, in we could use that term in terms of identity fusion with country, had a stronger sense of self, more self-concept clarity, and they found that their military, background, their patriotism, influenced their daily decisions more than civilians' decisions with regard to their job, their career. Okay, so these are people who are transitioning into a different career, and they didn't feel that same kind of connection. So I wonder if, as we spend more time in our group, whatever that group is, we become more and more fused, more and more identifying with that group, and we feel so much more confident in who we are, and have a better sense of self. And certainly that then impacts maybe our relations with other people. And we do see that in terms of military veterans transitioning out and having difficulty with new kinds of relationships, thinking about different kinds of possible selves in the future.
Is a fusion like an intensification of a sense of identity?
It's essentially just this, and identity fusion works really well for the military, right? Because it is about social bonding. And so people, I mean, you could speak to this far better than I can, but you get there, right? Everybody's wearing the same kind of deodorant, right? Everybody gets exactly the same vaccinations. Everybody, you're all in this together. And that's what gets the job done. And it doesn't bode as well for some aspects of life afterwards, though. And so, this sort of buying in is really beneficial to the group, and in terms of patriotism, really beneficial to the country. But then maybe sacrifices the individual on the back end if they want to transition or need to transition out of the group or have a different opinion.
Yes, the more deeply invested you are in one particular group, the harder it is for you to have multiple identities that might be in some conflict with it.
Yes, so our military veterans endorsed fewer of the provided possible selves, and they also generated fewer possible selves for themselves, now that they're transitioning out of the military, than did people who were transitioning out of one career and into another, civilians. So they were less able to see different, they were less able to generate possible selves and identified with fewer of the ones that we then provided after they generated their own.
And that might not be a bad thing, right? If you have too many selves or too many different labels you would attach to yourself, they might, each of them might become less and less important sequentially, right?
I think that's possible. I don't know that certainly that's true of, in a trial, the more stories you have, the less sort of traction any single story has. However, most research bears out that the more possible selves that we have, the better we cope, because of course, possible selves sort of fall by the wayside, right? I can't be a ballerina anymore, right? Nor am I going to be, president of the United States or whatever. So that's not happening. So I need to have many possible selves. As our kids maybe, leave the nest, people who are very, very invested in being a parent struggle a lot more when their kids leave than people who have other possible selves. So I wouldn't say that you're wrong, that too many possible selves might certainly be a problem, but most of the research has borne out that more is associated with better coping in times of transition or times when a goal has been thwarted.
I mean, that's good news for, thinking about the future of like how our society is going to cope with a lot of immigration and like that kind of diversity, because it suggests that, you can think of yourself in many different ways and there's not necessarily going to be like a conflict between those two. Although, so I guess that that maybe makes some problems with the theory I was contemplating earlier about investment in these particular identities. Why would that necessarily rival national identity? So, any thoughts, Mike?
The person I was thinking of right away was Soren Kierkegaard, and he talks about being lost in the finite and being lost in the infinite, right? So if you're lost in the infinite, you see all of these potential career choices, let's say. Future selves is another way of saying the same thing. But, you've got a vision of where you're going, the path you're going down. But if you're lost in the infinite, you can see this dizzying array of possibilities of where you should invest your efforts, and you don't know how to choose between any of them. And so you're paralyzed. Yes, you should think about it, put some serious thought into it. But ultimately, there may not be any good reason between path A, B, C, A, B, C, D, there are infinite numbers. And Kierkegaard said, look, we have to take this, at some point the most rational thing to do is to stop thinking and take a leap of faith. And so, being lost in the infinite is one problem. On the flip side, he also talks about being lost in the finite. So this might be the kind of problem that would, if Elizabeth is correct with the psychological literature that she's referring to, this might be the kind of problem that is facing veterans, where their vision of potential choices of career or future self or whatever is narrowed to the extent that they can't see beyond it, that there are alternatives, that they're just incapable for whatever reason of grasping them. I think that, from experience, I think I've experienced both of those problems. Certainly being lost in the finite, thinking that there is only a very limited number of choices, and that those choices are falling off one by one by one by one until this road is narrowing and narrowing and narrowing and narrowing. That for me corresponded with quite a depressed mindset, where I wasn't seeing the potential things that I could achieve. I thought that there were no other options. Yeah. So, I mean, is being lost in the finite synonymous with patriotism? I don't know. Well,
that's what I wonder if, if we think about, if we just think about patriotism as an example, if there's only a few ways to express or feel patriotism, then that seems like a bad thing, right? And if there's just like, well, everything's patriotic, that's we have to include every possible expression, if somebody says it's patriotic, it is, and we just have to accept it or whatever. That's probably not good either, right?
So there are two kind of ways, different ways of feeling patriotic that I'm familiar with. There's, on the one hand, the kind of jingoistic, we all hate immigrants because they're not us, kind of thing that I experienced down the pub in the 1990s and early 2000s and rallied against, the kind of the purity kind of based patriotism. Then there's another sense of patriotism that, Spencer talks about, the English philosopher Roger Scruton, which isn't necessarily a purity-based thing. So Scruton talks about patriotic may, in essence, be nothing particularly more complicated than simply liking where you come from, right? So for example, like my hometown where I am right now, Malmesbury, when I walk down these streets that have been here for hundreds of years, this building I live in predates the Declaration of Independence. I feel a strong sense of connection with the past. That then goes through literature, books, interests, a like for English ale, for example, that isn't shared by other people in other countries. It doesn't mean that I think English ale is objectively superior to Belgian lager. It's just that I prefer it. But there is a sense of liking where I'm from. And that sense of liking where I'm from is actually improved with diversity, albeit measured diversity. So, for example, if a local Indian family moves in round the corner and they bring with them their traditions, they introduce us to new kinds of food, maybe they open up a restaurant or one of them becomes a GP, and we start to enjoy things from another culture that integrates with our culture, that enriches the experience. It doesn't dilute it. But then there might be a kind of experience where you could find that your whole community had been replaced. So, for example, if you were from one of the northern towns of England and you'd grown up in you'd working class town with a local butcher, the local post office, and you'd grown up around that and you really like it, and yet you come back to that community and everything has changed. Nobody's speaking the same language. The buildings are still there, but the businesses are completely different. The local church is deserted. I think it's okay to feel a sense of loss about that. It doesn't mean that you think the people there are inferior, but there is a sense of loss.
Gentrified. It could be gentrified.
Or the opposite. Yeah, it could have been gentrified.
Yes.
Certainly. Well, so London, for example, is a perfect example of both of those two things. I can't stand London. I love the buildings, great restaurants, wonderful architecture, but it's just such an unfamiliar thing for me. Either it's gentrified to the point at which it's completely inaccessible to anybody but the ultra rich, or it seems to be another country. And I don't mean another country with people of a different race. Absolutely not. I mean another country in a sense that people aren't speaking English. And if I wanted to ask for directions to a certain place, I would struggle to get an answer in English at sometimes. And again, that's not saying that
So
makes
do
the
you
place
feel-
any better or
do you
worse.
feel-
It's just a disconnect.
Right.
Mm.
Well, that's what I was going to say, the disconnect. Do you feel less patriotic when you're in London than you do when you're at home? So this sense of nostalgia, which is, sort of joy plus sort of sadness, right? This sort of combination.
I just, honestly...
And, I don't know.
I just feel like whenever I'm in London, I just feel like I want to get out. And that's also because of the size of it and the crime rate relative, it's always the same in big cities, right? I just feel this kind of sense of discomfort. And I'd like, so that's the second kind of patriotism. That's the kind of the Scruton type of patriotism, which is, a gentle, and it's not believing that you're superior. It's not tied into jingoism. It's just a sense of familiarity and nostalgia and a sense of comfort that brings. And then I think there's a kind of a third kind of patriotism that I also think appeals to me. And that I'm going to call the Pinker style patriotism, in which you would say, well, okay, let's look at liberal democracies like the United Kingdom or the United States. And clearly we know that there are lots of problems that we have had in our histories, and we know that there are lots of problems we have yet to overcome.
In response to what you were saying, I was thinking that what was the problem of getting lost in the infinite, and I'm not familiar with Kierkegaard, but what you were describing sounded a lot like anomie, the notion of anomie, which I think Emil Durkheim came up with, the sociologist. And that's the idea of like there's a kind of suffering of not having enough structure imposed upon you. And I think it's a matter of personality, how much structure that is for people. But, there are people, for example, who are attracted to really authoritarian cults and authoritarian political movements and things like that. And you might ask, why is that? And part of the explanation might be that people seek out something that demands something of them and imposes something strict. They don't have to worry about who they are or what they're supposed to be doing. And I have thought that with the weakening of national identities in the West, you've got a worry that people who are attracted to strong, firm identities, who think they need that for themselves, and I think maybe everybody does to a degree, but more so than others, they might find that fulfillment somewhere else, right? Mm-hmm. So,
right, the military has definitely offered that to many people, right? They've offered that structure and, this, sort of a playground for your identity, right? A fenced-in playground for your identity, much less sort of wandering about, as Mike said, the infinite. But I think this is a really interesting idea that some of these other groups offer that same thing. I mean, as do, ideological terrorist groups, right? That kind of thing. So, I'm not necessarily, saying that these are morally equivalent, but that there's certainly, Kruglansky makes a really powerful argument that, that a lot of terrorists are really looking for that. Historically, there's been arguments that gang members are looking for that. So I think your idea that they're finding it in these other, ideological groups, certainly makes perfect sense.
So the case that came to my mind was one that I'd written about in my Quillette article several years ago, Inverted Nationalism and Orwellian Patriotism, in which there's a young man in Belgium who converted to Islam and joined ISIS and, guarded prisoners who were to be executed and stuff in either Syria or Iraq, and then came back. He was interviewed for this, and he said that he just sort of felt like he was out going to the clubs every night and drinking and doing the kind of things that you would expect a sort of listless 20-something person to be doing. But, he sought meaning. He sought something that imposed something upon him, and that's what attracted him to Islam and then to ISIS. And it was clear that Belgium wasn't giving that for him. But other nationalities that are confident of themselves might be able to give that to people. This is why I raised the concern earlier about, could you go too far in having too many identities? Like, if your identity is we're everything to everyone, like a collective identity, that doesn't attract a lot of people. Like no one wants to be a part of that necessarily. Well, I shouldn't say nobody does, but a lot of people won't. Like when you see conversions to Christianity, a lot of people who convert to Christianity, they choose like traditional Catholicism or evangelical Christianity as opposed to some, Unitarianism or something that's like the only thing we can say for sure about God is that she loves gay people and tolerance is good. I like some people are attracted to that, but some people want something that demands something of them, and some people want something that constrains who they are to something manageable, to something that gives some actual guidance. And they might not find that in liberal churches, and they might not find that in national identities that aren't very confident of themselves, that keep apologizing for things. The leaders of Canada in particular is bad about this, about being too apologetic on a world stage, when there are many, many, many worse countries than Canada that are not at all apologetic. Like, who wants to join that club? Who wants to have join the school that has no school pride? Like, people want something that claims to be distinctive and claims to give some direction for them. And patriotism can be something that does that in a healthy way or in a destructive way, depending on how it's manifest.
Yeah, I think that, that's listed as something that you want to argue in your book, right? That national loyalties can actually get people to, I think you said, transcend, more parochial identities, right? That, sort of maybe an enlightened patriotism. I don't know if you can explain what maybe you meant by that.
Okay, yeah. So to back up a bit, I want to distinguish two kinds of patriotism here. So one is purely psychological, and this is what you find in like just the dictionary definition, like love of country or loyalty toward country. That's morally neutral. You can have it to greater or lesser degrees, but there's no moral content to what I just described there. So another way of understanding patriotism, though, is as a virtue, like as a proper stance towards one's country, of which there are defective variants, right? Sometimes nationalism is defined in contrast to patriotism as like a defective version of patriotism. But forget about distinctions between nationalism and patriotism because there's so damn many of them. Like, it's like people should stop inventing new ways patriotism and nationalism are supposed to be, in contrast with one another, because there are just so many floating out there that it's no longer a helpful distinction to point to. But in any event, I think of it like along the lines of Aristotle's model of virtue. The mean between extremes.
Yeah,
I think this is a useful
ethics,
way.
Right?
Yeah, this is a useful way to think of things. I like to give these three examples from mass shootings in the U.S. Sorry, it's a morbid topic, but hear it out. So every action that is a virtue, there's a way of missing the mark that's in one of two ways. So courage is an example. You can have an excess or a deficiency of fear. So an excess of fear would be like what happened with the Uvalde officers in Texas who would not rescue the kids. They would not go into the building. That's cowardice. That's terrible. Everybody knows it's terrible. Now, something that hits it right in the middle as a courageous thing. You can find a video of this in Seattle in 2013 or 2014. there was a guy who saw a shooter and just tackled him and took hit him in the face with some mace that he was carrying and took his gun away and then pinned him down until the police came. So that's courage. And then if you go beyond that, you go to the other kind of vice, the vice of excess. Or no, I guess it would be the vice of deficiency, insufficient fear. That's not very common, but you do find it. At the Las Vegas mass shooting, where a guy was shooting down from a balcony at a concert below, there was a guy who like stood up, like swilled his beer, and then like gave the shooter the finger to make sure that he could see him. So that was rash. That was like, you shouldn't have done that. But it's still kind of badass. But it was dumb. But it was kind of bad. But although rashness and cowardice are vices, they're not equally vices. One of them we respect more than the other. But with patriotism, the way I see it is like this. So you've got, and actually, I think it's Edward Shills comes up with this idea of a mediated relationship to the primordial. So what's the primordial? You've got it's an attachment to land and to like kinship. That's the primordial. So if you go really, really extreme in that direction, you literally get Nazism. Blood and soil. That's the primordial, like explicitly. And if you go too far in the other direction, where there's no attachment to kinship and no attachment to any kind of territory, that is the vice of where you get to a kind of utopianism. You're rootless. You have no connection to a group of people, and that too is a bad thing. And that can prevent you from forming institutions that are valuable. So patriotism would be the mean between those extremes. It would be the virtue that's between those extremes. That's how I would understand, like, moral patriotism.
A virtue between two vices.
The virtue between two vices. Did I say it backwards?
No, I'm just trying to kind of re-articulate what you're saying. So that's kind of like the classic doctrine of the mean, right? You find out, you look at patriotism, you can understand the lack of patriotism, not feeling any connection, completely rudderless, not being able to connect with the people around you who have grown up within the culture that is fostered by their homeland. You can't connect with the institutions that also come from it, so you're completely aimless, and that's obviously not good, because then how are you supposed to navigate your world? On the one hand, the one extreme vice, if you like, and then the other extreme vice would be this kind of like the belief that everything that comes from your homeland is innately superior, and you must purge any kind of foreign influence, or at least radically control it, because your homeland is superior. So the kind of blood and soil fascist, German kind of fascist way of looking at things. Yes, if you identify those two vices and you try and find the middle point, which is where you do orient yourself around the culture that you exist within, and you appreciate it, and you make use of and hopefully contribute to the institutions that sustain it. The kind of connection between the dead and those who have yet to be born, as your favourite philosopher Edmund Burke would have put it. So
my favorite philosopher.
I thought he was your favourite. Is he not your favourite? Anyway,
I don't have a favourite. I like so many. You need them all. No one person got everything right.
Of course. I just remember when the first time I met you, you had a copy of Burke's Reflections on the Revolutions in France in your knapsack, and you were just pulling it out. And anyway, so we've got that kind of middle point but you are open to, like I was trying to say, you have this kind of affection towards the culture and gratitude. Gratitude, I think, is a huge point, right? You're grateful for the people that came before you and sacrificed, as imperfect as they are and as imperfect as what they made has turned out to be. It nevertheless delivers. It delivers in Western liberal democracies, at least, a kind of state of affairs that is better than it has been in any other sort of country anywhere else in the world at any point in human history, in my opinion. So you've got that, and that's the kind of middle point. And that, I think, would lead me on to kind of what I was trying to allude to earlier, which is a kind of a rational kind of patriotism. Do you understand where I'm going with that one?
Rational, did you say?
Yeah. So, for example, if you look at Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, I guess you've read that. You've both probably read that.
I have read parts of it, but I'm familiar with a lot of it because I go to humanprogress.org. It's got a lot of the statistics that he uses there.
Yeah,
Frequent that site.
Yeah, you get the basic premise is, look, okay, Western liberal democracies, liberalism, Enlightenment values have had problems, of course, some issues in the world, but nevertheless, it is the fruits of these kinds of societies that have enabled a kind of golden age that eclipses by far anything that has ever come before to flourish, to a kind of a flourishing of human society. And this comes as a consequence of the kind of values that have been established in liberal countries such as the United States, as well as the United Kingdom, Ireland, the Western European countries as well. And therefore, feeling patriotic about that would seem to be rational, right? These values have worked. We should cherish them, and we should further them as much as we possibly can.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. I want to challenge it in a second, what you said in part, but to say something affirmative, I remember getting back from my second deployment, which was to Afghanistan, and coming back to beautiful Boulder, Colorado. I was sort of shocked in a way to see that there were students there who had this completely repudiationist sort of attitude toward their country and society, although I knew they were there, but it was like, how can you possibly say down with the system when you've got it this good? Like, what are the chances that you're going to have it this good in the next system? Let's be honest. Like, you are studying art history or whatever it is at public expense, and you're living in Boulder, Colorado, where marijuana is all but legalized and about to actually be legalized, and there are no really enforced social restrictions on premarital sex. This is the position in which you find yourself, and you're like, I'm oppressed, down with the system, this is terrible. Makes me think you really don't realize how the world is, do you? And how it has been. On the other hand, I do hear the voice of opposition within me saying, yes, but only in material terms. Maybe it's good in material terms, but maybe there's something spiritually empty about it or morally empty about it. Or think about the debt that we're putting on our children and not repaying it. Think about what we're doing to the environment. And I'm very much concerned about animal cruelty. So maybe it's just that you take all those other things, maybe it doesn't stack up quite so well. But nonetheless, on the whole, I do want to say, when you have so many things working so well, it seems like your mind should be directed toward how do I eliminate the bad things, not how do I burn this all down and start over again, build it better.
Well, quite. So from a rational patriotic point of view, my retort would be, you've observed some problems there, but which system stands the best chance of solving those problems? Because on the one hand, you're saying, well, okay, there are these problems that are animal cruelty, for example, global warming, serious problems, agree on with both. And yet the kind of progress that would be needed to push back against those problems seems to be coming exclusively or almost exclusively from Western liberal democracies or similar countries like Japan and South Korea, which are made after the Western liberal democratic model.
Yeah, so focusing on what's working and figuring out how to make more of that, as opposed to tear down the system and rebuild. How long would it take to do good while we were focused on rebuilding something new? Right, a very, very long time. So it would seem that would be a step backwards, not a step forwards.
Well, yeah, because the kind of institutions that have enabled us to have what we have now. They, it's a mistake to think of them as being designed. I mean, to an extent they were designed, but really what has enabled them to be so effective is that like an organism that, evolves into a niche, into a certain environment and thrives in that environment because, many of its ancestors that didn't share the genetic makeup that enables it to flourish perished, and it's one of the few that survived. In many ways, that's what our institutions are. They've, over generations and generations, every generation has refined it and changed it and molded it in a certain way that has made it superior, else the institution dies, right? And so these institutions have evolved and are capable of delivering the kind of society that we live in. We're not done with them. Of course, we too have to make our contributions and to improve them, just like previous generations have also done. As Edmund Burke said, a society that can't conserve a society that can't change, can't conserve itself. The whole point of conservation, you need a degree of change. So if you think that, and this is the kind of arrogance that he was railing against in his reflections on the revolutions in France, if you think that, as somebody who has no experience in the affairs of states or in government or in administration, or even if you're somebody who has, if you think that you can suddenly go and just get rid of all the existing institutions that have evolved over centuries and replace them with new ones and expect them to do better, you're deluded. The chances of that happening are just infinitesimally small. And so have some sense of gratitude and some sense of pride in them. Recognize that there are things wrong with them. Recognize your duty that you have to change them. But you should feel gratitude and pride towards them.
Yeah, I think actually, hold on a second. Sorry. Elizabeth made a good point I want to add on to, which is that you can imagine something better than current arrangements. And often the challenge to the person who defends patriotism is how do you defend, current arrangements or the thing that gives people meaning to the extent that people get meaning from national identities. Now, why couldn't they get that from some other better institution in the future? And I think the answer to that would be, well, they could, but it isn't here yet. And you can't make it be here by just denigrating what we have. It's not as if destroying national identity is going to cause this supernatural national identity to emerge from the ashes, right? I think the best chance of getting something better than the nation state is to try to maintain nation states as well as we can and then see what evolves out of that. Maybe it'll evolve into something superior.
I've never thought about this before, but hearing you say it, the way that you said it, I think part of the myth of America is that exactly what you said probably isn't going to happen is what we believe happened, right? That we rose out of the ashes, right? That there were a few people who just saw what we should be and they wrote it down in a document and signed it and America became what it is now. And I think that's part of the American myth, right? And maybe part of what's contaminating the current system is, I'm part of a really smart group, a special group of people who have an insight that others don't have. And I can write this new script. And once we win, there will be another age of enlightenment and we will be better off. Hearing you articulate it like that sort of made me think, wait a minute, that's what we're taught, right?
Well, Mike, you'll be very happy to hear that I'm really quite an Anglophile, and I would like to emphasize the continuity between the United States and Britain more than the differences. I mean, I think the things that separated the U.S. and Britain during the War of Independence were relatively superficial. It had to do with particular political leadership in England, rather than deep philosophical differences between the two countries. Does that seem right to you?
I would agree, and I would also I'd up that one. I'd actually say that in many ways what the revolutionaries were initially asking for was just the enforcement of Anglo-Saxon norms within the United States. No taxation without representation. That's kind of like a norm that was already baked into English common law and British democracy, and that the British weren't. And I'm not an American historian, but so I'm not coming at this with any expertise. But my understanding of the foundation of America was that it was based simply on the fact that the Brits weren't living up to the deal they themselves had made, really. And in a way, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence do not come ex nihilo or ex nihil. They don't come out of nothing. They are, in a way, a distillation of the Enlightenment and largely the Anglo-Saxon side of the Enlightenment as well, of English common law, of Greek philosophy, of, I think, what we would call Judeo-Christian values. That's where they come from. They don't come out of nothing. And it's no surprise then that Brits and Americans, even today, are so culturally similar. I mean, for example, we got infected with wokeness because, it jumps from similar hosts, right? It's not something that easily infects the Japanese. Or we'll go to, so social contagions will spread very, very quickly and easily between our two countries, simply because we're so compatible, because we're based on the same cultural values. We're not identical, but the similarities are profound. And certainly I think there is a sense where, within the UK, if we were to think of somebody as being foreign, that would be a German person or a French person or a Chinese person or a Japanese person. An American isn't foreign. An American is an American. But they're not quite the same. We don't kind of think of Americans as being foreign. Maybe some English people do. Certainly I don't get that sense from English culture that English people think of Americans as being foreign. Is it the same the other way around? I don't know.
Well, I mean, if you ask me, think of a foreigner. Well, actually, now I would think of myself because I'm living in China.
Yeah, right.
That changes one's perspective. I was just thinking about how, you could maybe think of this as a kind of revenge. You made us put up your red coats, and now we're going to send bad ideas your way. Long time coming.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
But, I mean, if I were to think of a foreigner, like I'm going to introduce your friend, he's a foreigner, I would think this person is from India or this person is from Africa. I wouldn't expect somebody from England to be, it wouldn't be the first thing that would come to my mind, even though it's technically right. I certainly wouldn't think of somebody from Canada. I mean, that's kind of a joke because Canada and the U.S., it's so similar, Yeah.
Even though they hate to admit it.
I'm not sure right now, especially in the history textbooks that the kids are getting exposed to, that they're seeing that that affiliation with the UK or Britain. They're probably I just feel like what's really been focused on is the sort of it's the revolution, right? That we had to fight against the wrongs and everything. And I think that's maybe that culture is what's feeding some of what's going on now, and that this idea that we can rise up and make changes. And I don't disagree at all that certainly the U.S. Was built on the foundation that of hundreds of years or more before them. They didn't. It wasn't a whole new. The Declaration of Independence was not a whole new idea, right? But I do think we're kind of taught that in the U.S.
Yeah, it's important to remember, though, that's one act in this play, because the American Revolution didn't end with the independence from Britain. We still didn't have the Constitution yet. We had to get that. And if we would have just kept revolting, we would have torn each other apart. We would have been destroyed. That almost happened, and that's why you had to have the Constitution to sort of reimpose basically a British-style division of powers with some differences because there was no king to reestablish the order. So it was like it's interesting because the American Revolution has like you can think of it as like a liberal and a conservative pole to it, and on the extreme like left-wing side of it, you get these Enlightenment figures like Samuel Adams and Thomas Paine, and Thomas Jefferson was almost there with them. But then you had like Adams, who was more of a conservative, and he just wanted, like Mike was saying, he just wanted the English common law to be enforced. And you had these two sort of poles. So we revolted, but then we were able to come together and reestablish order. And we talk about justice now as like the fist in the air part and the revolting against injustice, but not the, okay, now we need to come together and establish order. That does not seem to be part of the conversation so much.
I agree, and stop me if you think I'm taking this too far. But I had said that I sort of wanted to talk about your article from 2021, political conviction and epistemic. Make the transition here. I think there might be like a little thread we can pull on this idea, this sort of epistemic injustice, sort of knowledge injustice. Well, maybe you should describe it instead of me trying to use your words from the article. What is epistemic injustice, and how is it being manifesting right now?
I don't see what connection it is you are trying to make here, I've got to say. But I'll tell you what it is. So there was this book by a philosopher named Miranda Fricker that came out in 2007. I can't remember the title of it off my head. I can't remember the title of it off the top of my head, but it was something like, it had epistemic injustice in the title. But basically the idea is that there is a particular way of harming or wronging someone by failing to believe them or failing to take their testimony seriously. That's one form of it. Another form of the injustice is something like there's a social situation in which people are prevented from having a valuable concept that they need to understand their surroundings. That's a little bit more complicated, so I'll just focus on the first kind. So the idea being that, so for example, a woman speaks up in a business meeting that's full of men, and people look at her and just think like, what is this? Who is this woman, and why is she talking here? And they completely ignore her point on the basis of her just being a woman. That would be an epistemic injustice because she might be entitled to be believed based on the content of what she said, were she not being judged based on her identity. So that's an example of that. So a lot of philosophers don't like this idea because it is a mixture of two areas of philosophy: epistemology, which concerns knowledge, and ethics, which concerns how we ought to treat one another. A lot of people insist on separating those two things. I think it's a terrible idea. I think knowledge and what we should believe, I do think there's an ethical component to that. And so I don't have that objection to the concept. But my article was just an extension of that idea to say that among the things that you can have prejudices against people that could create epistemic injustices are political identities, not just race and sex and sexual orientation and the usual sorts of identity categories that the left is interested in.
I think I can make a connection here.
Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, let's hear it.
Yeah, I think I can make a connection here. All right, so for example, let's look at a very real example, and one we've talked about throughout this discussion already. Let's look at Pinker's Enlightenment Now. where he basically makes the case that saying, yes, of course, we've got problems, but Western liberal democracies, such as especially the United States, are nevertheless the most tolerant, diverse, prosperous societies to have ever existed at any point in the planet. And he then, supplies all the evidence for that. The absolute vitriol he was then subjected to by, people in the New York Times, highly intelligent people who felt that he had said something that was fundamentally wrong insofar as he seems to have contradicted this, Russellian, noble, savage kind of, and, in favor of this kind of Hobbesian, nature is terrible, but these civilizations have built themselves up and they are the best places to live in. Insofar that he was defending Hobbes and having a go at Rousseau, backed up by evidence that he was saying that we should feel some sort of sense of pride and gratitude for the United States and the UK and these kind of countries, that there was something heretical about that. And there was a real objection. And in my view, that would be a kind of epistemic injustice, because the attacks on him some of them were transparently dishonest. Straw man attacks, arguing that he argued all kinds of things that he didn't actually say, cherry picking bits of the book where he might have made a mistake with some data here and there, and then saying that completely invalidated his whole argument when it was just an example. I mean, the kind of things that would be leveled against somebody. Somebody who would identify as conservative, for example, would get the same thing. They wouldn't be taken seriously. They would just be attacked, possibly by people who don't even really understand what conservatism is. So I think there is a link there, certainly. I mean, if you come up with this idea of being patriotic, about saying that I'm proud to be British or I'm proud to be American, within the kind of Guardian reading spheres, that's, you would be dismissed on that basis, wouldn't you? Immediately.
I mean, I think there would be a certain group of people who would immediately connect you to pride in the absolute worst things about Great Britain, or, in my case, the absolute worst things about the U.S., which we can agree there are plenty in both cases.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, like plenty of really bad stuff. Plenty of really bad stuff. That was bad English. Never mind. Plenty of bad things. But yeah, I think here's one thing that has occurred to me about this is there's a different level of criticism that is directed toward, let's say, a defense of patriotism as opposed to a defense of like black nationalism or a defense of like, I don't know, political solidarity of any of the kinds that the left is interested. Then the parochial identity, they're not worried about this complaint like, oh, isn't this going to be exclusionary of outsiders? The one is automatically connected to all of the ways patriotism has run off the rails in history, and the other is only connected to the civil rights movement, and that's it. There's a definite selectivity there.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, again, so speaking from personal experience, perhaps I'll give you an example of an epistemic injustice that I think I encountered. So around about the time when of the death of George Floyd and the subsequent protests that were happening, I made the case that there was no evidence at the time that George Floyd was killed as a consequence of Chauvin or any of the attending officers being racist. Well, maybe they were. I didn't know. I just said that there wasn't any evidence that I could see that was the case at the time, and I was open to having my mind changed. But I certainly wasn't confident that racism had motivated his, Floyd's death. First is the first thing I pointed out. And the second thing I pointed out was that this would lead to widespread rioting, and that even if we could see clearly that this one case was motivated by outright racism, it still wouldn't follow that every single police officer in Minneapolis was racist, much less every single police force in the United States. There wouldn't be evidence to support that, even if we could conclude that this one officer killed George Floyd motivated out of racial hatred. And the third thing I said was that based on what we had already seen in the Ferguson effect, the previous Ferguson effect, would be that this would result in widespread rioting and criminal damage that would disproportionately affect poor and ethnic minority communities, most of all black communities, negatively, leading to soaring rates of violent crime and homicide. And all that turned out to be true. But at the time when I was saying those things, I think very clearly, based on rational arguments, and a clear judgment of the evidence, people I knew who were actually critical of a lot of critical social justice stuff, but nevertheless had come under the sway of all of the social pressure that was prevalent at that time, concluded that I'd gone down a right-wing rabbit hole, and then started saying stuff like, "Oh, you know, Mike, he's a really nice guy, he's really intelligent and well-read, and we love him, and that's why we need to stage an intervention," and try to present it like I'd lost my mind. You know, even though what I was making was very clear. We're friends on Facebook. It was on my Facebook wall at the time, Spencer. All of the predictions that I made and some of the reactions that I got too. And they, you know, I don't like the term gaslighting because I think it's abused, but it was gaslighting. They tried to make it look like I had gone down a right-wing rabbit hole, had been radicalized by the far right, and yet I wasn't saying anything that really tied me to any right-wing positions at all. Not that that would necessarily be a bad thing either. You know, right-wing positions aren't bad because they're right-wing. You have to weigh these positions
what
up.
You know what I think is interesting about this? A few things. One of them is, have you heard in the philosophy of science? I don't know that much about the philosophy of science, but have you heard of this term, the theory-ladenness of perception?
No.
The idea is that when you see something, you are assuming some kind of background theory. You know, whether or not what you see in a particle collider, you know, whether you see the proton, that depends on what your ideas are. You know, because basically your framework of interpretation
in psychology, this would be theories of attribution. So, you know, we have a bias towards an internal attribution versus a situational attribution. So similar kind of theory in psychology.
Yeah, that's related. It's related. Yeah. So your theory of mind could determine, yeah, exactly. Like you see somebody, sometimes you say that you saw somebody act with an intention, right. But do you see the intention? No, an intention isn't a visible thing. You infer it from other things you believe. So it's as if people reacted to that video as if you could see the racism. Like I would say, how do you see the racism? Like, well, just look at the video. And I'm like, I don't see racism. And like, yes, of course you can see the racism. You're like, in fact, you don't just see Chauvin's racism, you see America's racism, because you see this knee on the neck. That is the embodiment of America's knee on the neck of all black people, and, you know, this kind of thing. Like, people were just seeing it, you know? And they didn't even think they were making an inference. They weren't making, it's not like they had an argument to take you from, this is what I saw in the video, this is what makes me conclude that Chauvin acted out of racism. It's that they brought the theory with them to the video.
Yeah,
and
this is getting closer to the connection that I was trying to make. This idea that, you know, because of this our tendency to discount situational forces and overweight, you know, personality or internal causation for actions, we sort of have the same. I feel like we're demonstrating the same bias. It gets back to the sort of like the system is flawed. Like Mike said, you know, not only is that police officer racist, but the entirety of the Minneapolis police force, and therefore the police in general, they're all racist. Out with them, right? We will create a new system. We'll have a revolution, and we'll fix it, and, you know, we'll throw out. You know, we're not going to respect what we've learned, what's gone well. We're just going to throw everything out and start start fresh. So it goes back to this sort of like this idea that you had mentioned in the article, this sort of one way to one what do I want to say, violation, a sort of epistemic justice would be to assess others as having some sort of pathology or vice. They're foolish, they're misguided, and that, so that the police force is pathological in its racism or in its implicit bias, to use a term that's still hot, even despite all the research that demonstrates it does not translate to behaviors. It's still, it's still there. So that it's implicit and it's within them. They are contaminated, and that contaminated system must be purged.
Mike?
Yes, I mean, this is what you talk about as coerced silencing, isn't it?
That it leads
that then it leads coerce to people into silence.
So,
those were terms that I borrowed from other writers, and there was silencing and there was smothering, and they all sound kind of the same. And I wish there were better terms available. So I can't remember which is which. All
right, fair enough. So, all right. So so another one you talk about that I really like was incompetent audiences. And you go into some reasons why audiences could be incompetent, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not intelligent or well-read enough. But I constantly find myself in a situation wherein, for example, I might raise, okay, how do you know that this particular case is an example of racism? What's your evidence? And I know fully well that the person I'm talking to is not going to be able to give me any evidence that it's indicative of racism. And then if I say, okay, well, even if it was a case of racism, what evidence do you have that this one police officer therefore shows, as a matter of course, that the whole police department of Minneapolis is also racist? And I know that I'm not going to be able to get an argument on that point either. And then I might go further. Okay, but even if I could show that the whole police department of Minneapolis was racist, if I was able to do that, how could you jump from that to the whole of every police force in America also being racist? And even if I could show that every police force in America was racist, how does it follow that every police force in the United Kingdom is racist by extension too? Because we had violent protests in the wake of the death of George Floyd in London. So there are all of these glaringly obvious non sequiturs that are just, they should be transparently obvious to even any half-intelligent person. And yet I feel that I cannot articulate any of them in the company of highly educated, intelligent, and articulate academics.
I guess
what's going on there?
I think that when you think you found a really obvious non sequitur among really intelligent people, what it means is you just haven't uncovered the hidden premises. You haven't excavated the premises yet. I tend to think that this is how we should think of logical fallacies, is that if something looks like a fallacy, the charitable way to understand it, and the way that is most likely to generate like progress in the conversation, is to try to dig up the premise that would make them connect A to B. And so if I were to try to do that, I would say something like, well, look, we know about the history of racism in the U.S. We know that there have been other videos like this. We've seen, like the Eric Garner case was similar in 2015. We know that black men are shot at a disproportionate rate, a rate disproportionate to their preponderance in the population. Okay, so that's my background theory, and I'm seeing this in light of my theory. It's the theory-ladenness of perception. So it's not like I'm starting with the video evidence and then arguing my way. It's that I'm bringing the theory based on those other bits of evidence to my perception of the video. I don't know what those terms
Instead
mean.
of from
maybe
bottom up would be from
Well, you see,
stimulus
we can be
to
charitable.
theory, and top down would be from theory to stimulus. Yeah.
Oh, yes. That's right. Yes, I would agree with that.
So we can be charitable with those people and try and understand and respect their opinions and respect them and so on and so forth. But there is nevertheless a quite unjust response from these people that you're talking to, that even if you try to articulate the kinds of things that I've just articulated, saying that these things don't make any sense, you know, it should go two ways, right? They should be, well, okay, Mike, do you understand the basis of what you've just explained to me? And as you know, we could poke holes in that too, but fine, you'd be on and I would, right? And you go with Roland Fryer and so on and so forth, but fine, but at least you'd be on a level playing field where you're respecting each other, you're listening to each other, and you're having a conversation, right? And you're not trying to say that the reason that the person is making that point is because they're malevolent, or they're mentally ill, or they're just stupid. And yet, that's what I get.
Right.
I'm happy to give the charity, and I always do, but I don't get it very often in return.
Yeah, so I guess they're not realizing that there's this theory-ladenness of perception thing that's happened, and they don't realize it. They don't realize that there are other ways of interpreting these sorts of things. I think that's probably
one of the
what's
reasons
happening.
that I was interested, that I really like this article, I think, is for my own personal reasons. I was canceled for doing research. My undergraduate students, black and brown, by the way, were doing research on Black Lives Matter, and somebody took a screenshot of a question, posted it online, and within hours, I was a white supremacist, racist. So we had 4 conditions based on, by the way, I mentioned Kruglanski earlier in the talk about, based on their metaphors of terrorism, and then also some researchers out of Stanford who did research on metaphors of crime, and we were applying it to Black Lives Matter. So we had research questions, a metaphor for COVID that was epidemiological, a metaphor that was crime, sort of a crime-based one, and then the same for Black Lives Matter. So COVID-19 is an open wound, so that's the epidemiological one, and then the sort of crime one, COVID-19, is now, of course, now I've only said this 47 times in the last 2 years, and I'm stuck. A wild beast. Yes.
A raging beast.
And so that would, a wild beast would tend to,
a wild beast
in past research, would inspire a militaristic response, where the open wound would inspire an epidemiological response. So help-based response. We did the same thing with Black Lives Matter. So in one, Black Lives Matter was an open wound in your community. How would you spend money that your community has to spend to address the issue? Black Lives Matter is a wild beast. And how would you spend the money? And so we collected data from over 400 participants before it all went bad. And so an entire research program was destroyed. 10,000 probably participants had participated in my research studies. My students went on to PhD programs and, good careers and everything. And I was actually also the Institutional Review Board chair, okay, which you would think is sort of an epistemic, right, and a knowledge base that I have, that that was relevant to ethics-based review of research and everything. I certainly didn't review my own research ever, but I was not summarily dismissed, but allowed to fade away from a job that I had done for 11 years, that had being the Institutional Review Board chair, and no research program just over and over and over again, big forums on campus, emails, personal and throughout, to the whole campus about our sort of, being devoid of morals and so shaming and ostracizing. But what got me here is this, and Mike had mentioned this also, this sort of underlying theme, in addition to the shaming and the ostracizing, was this idea that this pathological, this way of sort of we're foolish, where we lack credibility. So this idea that, nothing about our study, my students shouldn't be heard. I shouldn't be heard, except, in a particular manner, maybe that they would allow me to speak, right? That knowledge base of the past research that informed our research, the knowledge base of having an institutional review board, ethics review, that kind of thing, was essentially disregarded. That knowledge, the only knowledge that matters is that a person tweeted that was offensive. That's the knowledge that is credible now. And so this, I don't know what else to say about that. This being insulted and undermined, it sort of, steals your identity as an academic, right? So, you're not who you say you are. You don't have that knowledge base to speak to those issues.
There's a lot of emphasis is being put on who are you to say that, and I don't know, Mike. I was curious when you had this experience where people thought that we need to stage an intervention. Did it cause you to doubt yourself? Did you start to think maybe I am crazy?
I think it started to actually send me crazy. I didn't think I was crazy in what I had said, but it made me so angry.
Yeah.
And I was especially after a couple of drinks and late at night on my own, it's just that, how dare they? I know these arguments inside out. They were agreeing with these arguments 6 months ago. They were doing so quite eloquently and citing evidence and all the rest of it. Now they've caved into the crowd, and the positions that they're identifying with won't help the people that they want to pretend that they're helping, will actually do them harm. I can be so confident of this. I don't know this because I was talking about an event that was then in the future, but I can be so confident about that based upon the evidence that I had then, turned out to be true. And it was just the nauseating, the dishonesty, it makes me angry to think about it now. So certainly I thought I was going crazy insofar I was unhealthily angry.
And I think, I never apologized because I don't apologize for good science. And I don't apologize for research on rhetoric at a time when rhetoric is the center, say, of an impeachment trial, when an impeachment lawyer was saying, Donald Trump's rhetoric contributed to a riot on the Capitol, and the other side said, prove it. Right, at a time when research on rhetoric was, perhaps never more important, at a time when researching something that may be arguably the most important social movement in the last decade, the idea that it would be wrong, to do research on this social movement, it was something that I wasn't going to apologize for. So in my public life, to answer the question that you asked of Mike, it didn't make me feel crazy. But as Mike said, in my private time, in my alone times, you do start to wonder, what world. I felt like in a matter of hours, I was plopped I was taken out of an academic world that revered experimental research, right, as the goal, as the gold standard, right, into a world where there are topics that you're not allowed to research because maybe a question somewhere might offend somebody. And of course, psychology and sociology and social, all those, we certainly have done multitudes of research, say, on other topics we even discussed here today, like immigration and that kind of thing, where there were ugly questions embedded in there, questions on racism, authoritarianism scales, those kinds of things. But I was plopped from that world where research and empirical study is valued into a world in a matter of hours that I didn't understand. And that makes you feel crazy, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I remember there was one particular time I was at a conference. I was a very new graduate student, but it was a moral philosophy conference, and I remember this was like in 2010, a long time ago, and same-sex marriage was being debated heatedly in the U.S. at the time. Now it's kind of like one side has won that as much as anyone's ever won anything. But I remember saying, like, well, what about these arguments that there's something valuable about gender complementary parenthood? And I cited some actual science that said maybe there's something to that. I don't honestly remember all of what was said. It was a long time ago. But
right.
And keep in mind, this is an ethics conference. People debate crazy ideas at ethics conferences, but it wasn't like, oh, that's crazy. That's like the kind of response you get for a normal crazy idea. It was like people silent. It's like as if I just called the waiter the N-word or something. It was like that kind of a reaction. And then one of the professors who is like my, clearly my superior, clearly like somebody from my institution, everything, basically apologized to the table. And I just left feeling so terrible. And I thought, like, well, okay, maybe it wasn't a good argument, but neither are most of these arguments, like, good God. And I thought, like, once somebody feels that, once somebody realizes that, oh, you start pushing on certain things and you get that reaction, they'll never bring it up again. I think people are, I think people are very weak when it comes to standing up to social pressure. I think most people will go along with something if they think that they're going to be called a racist or something for not going along with it. I really think that's all it takes. And I don't know, Mike, do you think there's anything that can be done to train academics to be more resilient when it comes to social pressure?
I think that we've been recruiting the wrong people as academics. I mean, as you know, I spent most of my 20s just being a party boy, and then when my wife kicked my ass and made me become an academic to have some kind of vague future around my late 20s, I started to change. But I mean, for me personally, I'd always been somebody who read a lot, who reflected a lot, who thought a lot. And the thing that really enticed me about academia was that I thought that I would be among my people. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yes, I know exactly what you mean.
This is not an identity statement in terms of ethnicity, because that's not really what I identify with. I've always been an oddball. I'm a bit on the spectrum. I'm enthused by ideas. I like to sometimes argue, not dishonestly, because I will be upfront and honest about everything, but sometimes I like to argue positions that I don't agree with so that I can kind of dismantle them and try and understand them better, take them apart, put them back together again, all of that kind of stuff. It's a joy to me. It's just one of the things. And I know that means that I'm fucking weird. Like I'm not normal. Most people don't enjoy doing that kind of thing. And people enjoy doing things that I don't enjoy doing, like playing football or soccer and again, I'm not presenting that as being superior, but my sense of identity has always been not really around being English or British or white or male, but really about ideas. And whoever will listen to me, will have a conversation with me, ideally over a beer, doesn't have to be over a beer. That's my people, right? That's who I want to be around.
I think that's a sort of, we thought
present
we
company
were
included.
Joining, right? We thought that identity and sort of what I was talking about was the sort of idea that I thought that the patriotism to the experimental method, to, revere past research and how it could be replicated and extended would trump, would supersede some minor, like disagreement over something. And that turned out not to be true. And I think that that's what so many of us are finding, is that this overarching identity, patriotism that we envisioned in academe is not, it doesn't supersede.
It's been awful.
So one final, I've got one final thought here that sort of ties this together. By the way, suggested reading for you, Elizabeth. Michael Polanyi's The Republic of Science. Yeah, you might find that interesting. But it occurs to me that a lot of these identities can be sustained or undermined by similar things. So when my wife and I were fiancés, right, like a little more than a year ago, we were just engaged, and we were doing premarital counseling. And one of the things we watched during the premarital counseling, I wish I could remember this guy's name, but he was
John Gottman,
a scholar, like a psychologist or sociologist of marriage or something like that. I need to look. John Gottman. It's John Gottman. That's the guy. Thank you. So about his research where he would observe married couples in these small settings, and for 5 minutes at a time, and then he would notice certain patterns of behavior that would allow him to predict their likelihood of staying together or breaking up over years. And he got to be amazingly accurate at it. So one of the things that he observed was that there was a kind of gentleness with the way they talked to each other, the couples who stayed together. It's like, oh, honey, maybe you should think about it this way, that kind of thing. And the thing that was most predictive of couples breaking apart was contempt. And I think there was like biting sarcasm was like another thing that was almost as bad. But contempt was the real killer. And I thought about that, and I'm speculating. I don't know of any more experimental research on this. But I would be willing to bet that what undermines a marriage undermines friendships, undermines professions, undermines countries. I think that it just levels up. I think contempt will split apart countries as well as it will split apart marriages. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean a literal partition, like the American Civil War or something. But I strongly suspect that it will corrode the sense of identity just as strongly, no matter what we're talking about. Whether it's scholars as a community, or whether it's a group of friends, or what have you.
Okay, so I think we're nearing a point to conclude on there. We've gone through patriotism and the obvious ways in which we all know it can be evil when it kind of spills over into blood and soil stuff, and how that's useful as a reference point, actually, that vice being on one side and then the vice on the other, this aimlessness of not feeling any connection to the kind of society you grew up in, and how finding a middle point between those two vices is a good thing. But then looking at how this, how the observations about losing a sense of identity is a bad thing also applies to to marriages, to academia as a setting. I certainly have found that completely. Good. So we've gone through a lot of problems. This huge sense of a loss of identity, the loss of a sense of national identity, the belief that a national identity, amongst Guardian circles, for example, is a largely negative thing. The turning to bad ideas, the turning to cancellation, which I think we've all kind of experienced on one level or another, and the isolation and shaming and the negative pressure that builds. And this is the way we end everything. I think that this is a long fight. I think that there aren't any easy solutions. Are not kind of any immediate tactical breakthroughs that we can make right now and win this cultural war tomorrow. But is there anything we can do? Even if it's a small thing for a long game, is there anything we can do? Any thoughts there, Spencer?
Well, I think we need to individually do a couple of things. One is just be a little bit more willing to absorb social criticism when you think it's necessary, because I think it's so easy not to say something that will attract some kind of negative reaction, or even to go along and say something that you think is going to get you praise for being the right sort of person, even if you personally have your doubts about it. And I think maybe the best thing we can individually do is just personally be a little bit more resilient against that kind of thing. Not saying don't go out on a limb and risk your job or something like that, but if you think that you might have to endure some sort of minor social unpleasantness for saying what you think is true, I think you need to get into the habit of just absorbing it. That would be one thing. And the other thing is, sanity preservation. Don't spend too much time online. Don't get swept away with things that don't really matter. In an insane world, you've got to keep your sanity above everything else.
Very good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.